I've gone through the questions. A number of them are very similar, and I'll try to group them together when it makes sense. At the end, if we get through these and we still have some more time, obviously you'll be able to raise your hand, and we'll continue with that. And what we're going to do is I'll read the question, and some of them, I would say it's obvious who on the panel would answer it. Yeah, we got a lot of those. And Denise is going to sit on the panel, but she had another commitment as well. So when she slips out, Cindy, also from the Indiana Office of the Attorney General, is going to come up and replace her. Thank you again for coming today. Okay. The first one, there's three of them together I'm going to kind of ask. Do the men who get caught for solicitation have to register as a sex offender? Why aren't there some punishment for a person convicted of being a sex offender? And remind me again what happens to someone when they're caught trafficking the client, the buyer. So that kind of leans toward Denise. And if any of you other agencies want to jump in, go for it.
Okay, I don't think I'm turned on here. Now I'm turned on. No, they don't. Well, first of all, they don't register on the sex offender registry. Typically, if they're found guilty of human trafficking as a buyer. When I talked about the penalties under the human trafficking statute for the buyer, it's, I think, a level 5 felony, which is about a year. So the penalty is really low. And so, you do what you can, but obviously our first goal is to try to get to the trafficker. But with regard to those purchasers out there, we also recognize that if they didn't exist, the problem wouldn't exist. And so we do what we can to try to identify them.
Okay, when you're talking, when you're talking about the laws, first time I heard Tim speak, and because I have the mic, I can get my own question out there. He mentioned about that the buyers pretty much are let go. They walk away and nobody even knows about it. And he mentioned, well, if they had to spend the night in jail one night, then it's like a flag goes up. The wife's going to find out, the job's going to find out, and maybe that would help. Is that something when you talk about this summer, the legislature getting together talking about laws, is that even possible where, because one of the other questions was, making sure that they're brought forth publicly, like maybe putting the name in the paper. I don't know that would make it through a vote, but focusing on the person making the purchase, like public shaming, for lack of a better way to put it.
The problem is that with investigative details, those people are very hard to identify. It's not like they're using, when they make these arrangements, they're not using their real name. They're not giving an address. So they can be difficult. There are, I guess, investigative methods of trying to get to them. That it involves a lot of manpower and it involves money. And so typically, having the resources to do that has been difficult. It is something that we would love to be able to do. But with certainly our budgetary constraints, that makes it even more difficult. But we have in the past, at least, even with regards to if we caught them on prostitution, which is a much lower, that's a misdemeanor crime. But if we caught them there, going back to finding their address, then going back to their home newspapers and putting that in the paper to see what that might do.
Okay, Tim, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I had a question. Denise, you mentioned the case of the stepfather who exploited the 12-year-old, and there were 2 regular buyers. Were those regular buyers prosecuted?
One of them was identified, and I believe the answer to that is yes. The other was never, to my knowledge, identified by anything other than we had a first. Kokomo had a first name. But
no cell phone records?
There were no numbers that came back. They buy drop phones, so you can't trace those phones back, typically. To my knowledge, though, again, the one who was identified probably should have been prosecuted for child molest rather than the human trafficking, because human trafficking is such a low level of offense. If you can actually identify them and it's a minor victim, you're better off going with a molest charge. But to my knowledge, was arrested for the level 5 case.
What's the difference between the child molest and somebody having sex with an underage child?
About 20 years.
That's under Indiana law. Other states have much tougher laws on this. Washington State, for example, it's you can be charged with commercial sexual abuse of a child, and you're going to face very stiff penalties. So we're lenient in this area.
What's the, I mean, not charge-wise, but
The definition?
yeah, I mean, yeah, if you're having sex with an underage child, why is it child molestation no matter what? Whether you pay for it or not, I guess.
Right, and it would be. It's just, it comes down to how did the prosecutor in that particular case charge the case? What did the prosecutor there do? And again, that's a case that obviously existed before our unit was formed, but for whatever reason, and it may be, sometimes it's a simple matter that the child, as in the case, is not going to fully cooperate. And if the child doesn't indicate who did it, and you don't have other proof, sometimes as a prosecutor, there's nowhere you can go with that.
You're asking the question that 150 members of the General Assembly ought to be asking, because you're exactly right.
Okay, this one I think any of you could answer, because you've all dealt with women coming out of the sex trade. Often women are addicted to the money. It's hard to convince a woman that other employment will compensate equally. What do you say to that?
I'll go first, if that's okay. First of all, most of these women that are trafficked don't have the money. Their trafficker does. They're coerced by the purchases of a phone, the clothes, the drugs. You got to remember that over 95% of these women are addicted to some substance, either because they started to use as a child to numb their pain, or they've been introduced to it by the trafficker. And so the purchase of a drug in lieu and have a cash on their person is much greater. And so there's a false belief that a lot of these women have made so much money and have that money. They don't. It's their trafficker that benefits from the cash. They ultimately only get certain things to keep them in place. And that's a myth. There's a difference between a woman who engages, quote unquote, in prostitution and a woman that's been trafficked. And I very politically watched that line carefully, because it was like Tracy was saying earlier, nobody wakes up one day and says, I want to be a prostitute. And so the funding is not there for them. When it comes to holding a job, because they have to make so much money, and most of them don't have a college education, and some of them do. Some of them put themselves through school. But if they've never had a regular job where they get a regular paycheck, it's hard for them to even go into dealing with bill paying, purchasing things. And that's a real struggle. It's easier for me to stay in a lifestyle that I'm accustomed to, even though it's painful, and have things quote unquote handed to me, than to go to work for $7.50 an hour or $10 an hour and not know how to pay my bills.
I would say I see both sides of it, because in the strip clubs, some are being trafficked through and are on a multiple city rotation. And then there are women that have their own independent contract with that club. And often it is true, they're either supporting a drug habit or coming out of poverty or have no education, no GED. And for those, it is a temptation. But one of the things I'm doing when I'm counseling them is talking to them about how it's hurting them psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, tearing them down in ways they often don't even realize, and plus the dangers.
Anything else to add? Tracy, you got anything to add?
I mean, I would just add, I mean, it's a cycle. You know, sometimes it's a generational cycle. If you have a woman and she is working in a strip club and she's bringing home $1,500 a week, and you know, are trying to get her out, and you offer her a shelter, and then you offer her a job like at Wendy's, and I don't even know what minimum wage is, but, you know, it's hard for someone to want to take that, even though they want a different life, they want to change, but they still want a house, they want to provide for their kids. And I think even for girls, you know, I've had girls who've been trafficked who got out of the life, who are young, who try to take that power and control back and exploit themselves, and they're making a lot of money and it's not going anywhere, but it becomes kind of this power and control where they think that they're kind of controlling the show, and it's just difficult for them.
Okay. Now this is another one that any of you can answer. It says, are you organizations working together at all, sharing resources and information? I mean, because you represent a lot of the agencies out there that are fighting human trafficking, and then we've got a couple of Purchase and Ascent 121 as well, and there's more. Is there a hierarchy, someone who looks down on all of you, or you just work together by knowing each other, or how would you answer that? How are you working together at all, sharing resources and information?
I've been so thankful for the opening of the Hope Center. This was a long time answer to prayer for us, because in many of our cities, we virtually had no place to send the girls when they did want to get out. And it's been a huge problem, and that it doesn't work very well to try to get them like in a homeless shelter. Those two populations are so different. So we're in partnership. Light and Darkness is in partnership with the Hope Center. And I've been helping with training their house staff, and they are a big, big help to us in a quality long-term care facility for our ladies to go. So we're like the outreach arm working together.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on IPATH for 6 years, but for Restored, we have MOUs with certain people. we partner with the Youth Opportunity Center. I've been working with them for 4+ years. That's where a lot of times our kids go. And then we work with the Salvation Army and the Julian Center for some of the adults. And then when we do stuff across the state, we tap into resources with either ITVAP or things with IPATH to see kind of what places are available for victims when we're in those certain areas.
I think for us, being quote-unquote the newest kids on the block pretty much at times, I think that being open-minded to collaboration is number one. And sometimes out of the care and concern for the people and the population that we work with, it's almost like I'm not sure if others know what they're doing, and do I take a risk? And so for us, we're open-minded to be teachable. We want to collaborate with any organization that we can in every aspect, not just including other organizations that specifically address human trafficking, but also those clinical services, health services, mental health services, and community agencies that can help with assisting that holistic process of healing that starts with the first step.
Okay, thank you. All right, this one might lean more toward Denise. You answered it some, but the question reads, what, if any, actions are being considered by the Indiana legislature to deter buyers from purchasing victims of human trafficking?
I can't say that there is anything before the legislature right now to deter buyers specifically. Like I said, we need to work on all of the penalties for the human trafficking violations, and that's something that we're trying to work legislatively to make sure next year it's on the agenda. But other than that, I'm not aware of anything specifically.
So would it be on your agenda next year to address something like this? That's what you said? Yeah. Hopefully. Okay. This one is addressed to Tim. In your research, how many people statistically in power, i.e. politicians, legislators, lawyers, police officers, were involved in the demand of exploited children, and so that they do not want anything done about it? Thank you, Denise. Can we have a round of applause for Denise? So basically the question, I mean, how many of these people did you find were involved in the buyers and then not want to do anything about it because they're the buyers?
It's a good question. I have not seen any hard research on the numbers. So if they ask statistically, I've not seen anything that pins a number down. What I have seen across the country is that you have police officers, you have pastors, you have teachers who are arrested for trying to buy kids. There was a judge in Kentucky in the last year who has now been convicted of purchasing underage girls. So it is spread throughout, I would say, all professions. And certainly there are people in positions of authority who exploit kids, who are buying sex. I think one of the problems that we have in talking to our legislature is that it's, and I'm generalizing here, but there are a lot of older men who are legislators. And I think it's hard for them to relate to and understand these issues on a gut level. And so the more conversations that citizens can have about these issues and conversations that, hey, I really care about this, we really need to do something, and we do need to hold buyers accountable. And there are ways to do it. There are other states that have taken good steps to begin to hold buyers accountable, and there's no reason why it can't happen in Indiana.
Okay.
What is the best method you've seen other states using to hold them accountable?
So King County, Washington is often held up as a model. That's Seattle. I spent some time out there seeing what they were doing, and one of the things one of the changes they made was, instead of arresting people who they rightly see as victims and causing a lot of legal complications in their lives, they shifted their focus to go after the buyers and hold buyers legally accountable. So there are very meaty consequences in place. The John School that I visited there, for example, if you're convicted of trying to buy sex in King County, or not even convicted, if you're charged, you can, as a part of your plea arrangement, you can sign up for this school, but it costs you $900 to attend. It's a 10-week class, and you're there 3 nights a week. And one of the things that does, the buyers want to operate in the shadows. The thing that I found that they're the most scared of is that people in their lives will find out what they've been doing. And so they really want to hide their activity. They're very fearful that a spouse or a girlfriend or an employer will find out. If you have to attend a class for 10 weeks, 3 nights, I mean 3 hours a night for 10 weeks, it's very hard to hide that. People are going to find out what's going on, right? The men I talked to, one of the classes I sat in on, the subject that night was shame and guilt, and they were asked, what have you felt shame about recently? And several of them said, when I had to call my wife from jail to ask her to come pick me up, and she said, why are you there? And they had to explain that they were arrested for trying to buy sex. There is a very real consequence in their lives. And that's not necessarily law enforcement. We're not sending them away to jail for 6 months or a year or 5 years. It's just putting real consequences in their lives that otherwise they're really going to try and hide.
Okay, and this is another question. Am I on? Yeah, okay. Directed to Tim. I think you answered most of it, but I'm going to read it in case it says, Tim.Swarens and panel, you cited the Washington state criminal statutes. Is that unusually effective? What is comparable in Indiana, if anything? And how effective are the buyers in Washington state prosecuted and tried by juries? So anything you want to add, either Cindy or Tim, based on that question that you haven't already answered?
Well, am I on? Yeah. I think Denise has already kind of illustrated that we don't have anything that sounds like it's comparable to what Tim's talking about. Essentially, if we've got buyers out there who are engaging in prostitution, it's a misdemeanor. If we have ones that are actually doing trafficking, then again, it depends on us being able to identify them. And about the only time that I can think of right now where that's going to be pretty handy is going to be in some kind of reverse sting operation where you actually catch them in the act. Otherwise, they are out there operating through drop phones and so forth, and without the cooperation of the victim, we aren't going to see a lot of consequences for the one who is the buyer in the human trafficking. I think everything that Tim has said sounds great, and we certainly, from the standpoint of trying to get some guidance and direction in future legislation, I'd love to hear more about that and see if we can kind of put something into place to give some new ideas.
So those classes that he was talking about, the state of Washington, I think that would be effective. So you two should probably talk.
Yeah, so there are a lot of John schools around the country, and some are more effective than others. Some are, you know, really kind of a joke, to be honest. But then the King County class, which is court ordered, is very substantive, and it's, you know, the founder of that, the person who operates it, though, you know, he's the first to say we've got one shot with these guys because they become smarter after the first time. It's not unlike, you know, somebody who's pulled over for speeding or whatever, right? You learn to adapt, and these buyers are the same way. If you can't really change them in that 10-week period, you're probably not going to see them again. They'll just be smarter buyers. Now, I would say that Congress in 2015 passed federal legislation that made it easier for federal prosecutors to go after buyers. And we've seen an uptick in federal prosecutions of buyers, not huge numbers, but more. One case out of the Cleveland area, for example, a guy 55 years old who was buying this 14-year-old repeatedly, and they were able to, again, trace the cell number, you know, from her phone. And I don't think police and prosecutors do that often enough to trace the numbers back. They trace the numbers back on her phone because his number turned up a lot. And he was, you know, he's serving 15 years in federal prison now for repeatedly paying to abuse a 14-year-old.
Now, when Cindy was talking about that, a lot of times the girls or the victims don't admit it. They don't try to prosecute it. When I first heard that a while back, I was like, what? Of course they want them punished. And I have 2 points that I've learned through going to different seminars or whatever. One is a lot of times they think that they love the person who's trafficking them. They're like a boyfriend figure. They're meeting their needs. So we can't believe it, but apparently they feel like they're in love. And another one is I don't remember who said this, but they said, imagine your last sexual experience, whatever it was, just think about it. And then imagine sitting in front of a bunch of people that you don't know and telling every detail over and over again. None of us want to do that. So those are two things that might answer the question why a victim wouldn't go through with the prosecution. And this one I think might be, Tracy might be able to, because you work with Child Services some. It says, Child Services, aren't they responsible for putting kids into foster care? That's part of the problem. How is it they also help you to care for kids rescued?
Say that last part again, sorry.
How is it that they also help you to care for kids rescued? I guess talk about your interaction with DCS and with the foster care system.
Well, I mean, I think there's so much in that question. You know, DCS is set up to, you know, they come out, they do an assessment, they try to do as much as they possibly can. That's okay. With children. So I think, you know, when you have someone who is coming out of or recovered in a hotel or who's been trafficked, you know, going to foster care is not really best practice. You know, these kids need extensive treatment, and a lot of times if they're going straight to foster care, they just run away. I mean, that just happens. So I think, you know, DCS collaborates with a lot of individuals. You know, they make that recommendation, but, you know, like, for example, with Restored, you know, our advocates see the kids once a week. You know, they go to court with them and advocate and, you know, for treatment and walk aside those. You know, DCS, they have, you know, one person probably has anywhere between 35 kids. So where our victim advocates don't have that. So it takes they partner with multiple agencies to be able to give proper treatment to one child. So.
And I kind of read in that question, too, that you were saying, and I don't know who asked it, that there might be a problem in the foster care system, that they're part of the problem. They're inundated with, they need help. So if that's something you're concerned about, you can sign up to be a court-appointed special advocate, and you can help the foster care system because they have so many people in the system. They need your help from a volunteer basis. I'm a CASA, so that's a plug for them. Anybody can answer this. Where did the demand come from? Has it historically always been there? Now it's amplified by the easy access of internet? Anything to say about that, anybody?
You know, we don't do a lot of demand work, but I do some stuff. We've talked about how to address the demand, and Tim and I have had this conversation. It really goes back again to it's cultural. It's what Tim said earlier. You know, we're not talking about, you know, pornography. You know, it's everywhere. You know, we have one of our guys who did a reversal. You know, in 24 hours, he had over 400 text messages. 400 of individuals who want to purchase sex from him. Not in Indianapolis. So we have this huge cultural shift where I think people think it's okay to, like, it's just normalized. You know, most of my kids will say to me, and it's the truth on the buyer side, and it's the truth on the trafficker side. You know, they've been trafficked, they've had to have, you know, sex with 10 people that day maybe before somebody recovered them or they got out of the situation. Nothing happens to those buyers, but then sometimes nothing happens to the trafficker. So again, they're there, and it's like they have to relive their trauma. They have to be in treatment for a really long time. They have to try to navigate the system. And for them, sometimes it's just like, why does it matter? Why does it matter if I testify? Why does it matter if I even give these names up? Because is anybody really going to do anything about it?
Okay, thank you.
I think there's good reason to believe that the sex trade has grown because of the internet. Obviously, prostitution, exploitation have been around for millennia. That's not new. What's allowed it to expand is the ability to safely, it feels safe, to connect, to purchase a person online. You can make an arrangement online to meet that person you're buying in a hotel that's in a quote-unquote safe area, hotels here in Castleton, for example, rather than having to get in your car and drive to an area of town where you might feel unsafe, where you're not familiar with the surroundings, all of the things that might keep you from doing that. And so the anonymity and the felt security of the internet has expanded the number of men who purchase sex. Most men don't buy sex, but it's expanded the number of men who will do that because they feel safe doing it. I know in talking to like Captain Cohn with the Indiana State Police, he runs the Internet Crimes Unit there. They work a lot of child pornography cases. They're seeing younger victims and a significant increase in sadistic images. And the thinking is, the research is showing, is because of the frequency which our users are accessing pornography, that in order to obtain the same high, they need increasingly more perverse, provocative images.
Could it be that, I mean, it's expanding, we say, but could part of it, of the expansion, be just because we're thinking it's happening more because we're aware of it and people are talking about it and we're having these seminars and these, articles in the paper?
I mean, I would, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, our nation is in a sexual experimentation epidemic. It's the further we get away from Judeo-Christian values, the more this is so pervasive. And even in our young children, 10, 11, and 12, are being encouraged to experiment sexually, and it just continues on. One of the latest statistics I had read was that now 1 in 4 high school students in America, when they graduate, already have an STD. 1 in 4.
How can we change the culture of our country?
We need Christians witnessing and shining the light of Christ, for one thing.
I want to go back to that question right before for what Tim said. I think that people don't understand, before it gets to trafficking, that the U.S. is so, just in general, like, it's so sexualized. Like, I could bring in 50 kids who are between the ages of 11 to 15 right now, and probably at least 40, 50, not maybe low, if I ask them online if someone has sent them an inappropriate picture of themselves, they would raise their hand and say yes. 11 to 15. And that just leads, like, when we talk about trafficking, or we're talking about prevention, or we're talking about pornography or sextortion, all these things that are happening, the internet is huge for that. And Tim is right. Like, these kids, they are going online for connection. And that connection is leading to, I have kids who are going to church every day, have great parents, but they want that attention, and they're like, well, if I just send one this picture, it's going to be okay. And that's happening all around us. One of my biggest counties is Hamilton County. That is happening all around us. And I think that's why we really have to address and have open, realistic conversations with our kids, because what are we going to do? Law enforcement's not going to give them, because if you take a picture and it's on someone's phone, it's child pornography. We're not going to give kids level 6 felonies. So we have to figure out a different way to get to these kids before their pictures are online, because the internet is just a funnel. Like I said earlier, there's, for every you see that's on undercover trying to go on there looking, there's hundreds of predators trying to do the same things to get their hands on these children, both boys and girls.
Can I touch base on that real quick? What Tracy was saying, I just want to piggyback on it. A couple of months ago, they had a report on the news about Hancock County, and the prosecutor was looking at 9 cases of sexting. When I spoke to a lot of people from Hancock County, they didn't even know about that report. And the reason I'm saying that is because awareness is number one, but when we ignore the issue that the sexualizing in society is so great, we continue to contribute to the problem. It's not something that can be ignored. It's sad to hear that so many kids are experiencing this, And they think it's normal. So we're normalizing the sexualization of our society in our youth first, and the trafficking usually starts afterwards. Because if they're seeking that kind of attention online or through a text, when they get that first approach from a predator who's starting to groom them, they latch on because they're seeking that attention. And where do we contribute to the process of at least starting to drop the pennies in the bucket to start the sway to change it? You know, asking a question is great, but I haven't heard a lot of questions about what can I do? What's next? This is the process. Listening to the experts like Tracy and Tim and Cindy and Denise and Carolyn. I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself a novice. Listening to what they have to say and not sitting still after this conference is the first step.
Which leads me to this question. It says, if men in the church are part of the demand of the commercial sex trade, why is this never brought up in the pulpit? Well, a couple of years ago, when I read an article in the paper, I was floored that this was going on. It was up in Hancock County. Tim probably wrote it, and Tracy's picture was there talking about it. And so I Googled it, and I educated myself, and I started going to events and learning more about it, and I went and I approached Pastor Kite, and I said, this is happening. We need to let our church know, because awareness is the first step. So what I did is I told him I wanted to do that, and he said, go for it. Get Tim.Swarens, or Swarens. I always pronounce your name wrong. Tim. We're going to go for Tim. And he said yes.
I've been called far worse, so don't worry.
Okay. Anyway, so what we did is we had our first service at 9 o'clock, and when it was over, we all just kind of migrated to another part of the church, sat down. Tim talked for 45 to 50 minutes, and then people who had to come back to the next service came. So I brought it to the church just by saying, hey, Pastor Kite, and every one of these people have said they'll go. You don't have to do a Saturday event where people don't want to get out of bed at 9 o'clock in the morning. You have people in the pews already. They can come on a Sunday. All you have to do is ask. And there's 2 agents